Relatives of Coleman's victims arrived by bus this morning to witness his execution.
He is continuing to be very calm and very compliant, cooperating in every way, not creating any problems whatsoever over at the death house.
Coleman spent his last hours visiting with spiritual advisors and his attorneys until the 8:45 cutoff time,
at which time he will be offered a shower, and then we will prepare him for the execution process.
The execution process began just before 10. A doctor gave Coleman a shot to sedate him, a second shot to slow his heart rate. He was then transferred from a holding cell 17 steps to the death chamber.
Mr. Coleman came in wearing a non-denominational, we're told, prayer shawl.
When he walked in, he seemed quite confident. It happened quite fast. And he seemed to kind of adjust his shawl and then did not need any kind of escorting onto the gurney.
Coleman made a last statement, but he didn't use his own words. Instead, he quoted the 23rd Psalms.
He repeated, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, and continued with that.
And then it seemed like his chest heaved. He took a couple quick breaths, maybe probably about 8 or 9. And then that's kind of when he just stopped. It was no big last breath.
The execution process for inmate Alton Coleman has been completed. The official time of death, 10:13.
In the summer of 1984, police across the American Midwest faced something they had never seen before. Crimes were happening across state lines so fast that investigators couldn't keep up. 6 states would be hit. 8 people would die. Dozens more would have their lives changed forever by 2 people who were good at making others trust them before they attacked. The crime started in late May in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and didn't stop until late July in Evanston, Illinois. Between these 2 places, Alton Coleman and Debra Brown traveled through Indiana, Michigan, and Ohio, leaving bodies behind that would get the FBI's attention. The FBI did something rare. They created an extra spot on their 10 most wanted list just for Coleman. They only did this for the most dangerous criminals who were still out there killing. What made this case so hard was how the couple worked. They moved fast, never staying in one place long enough for police to figure out their pattern. They stole new cars all the time. They changed how they looked constantly. They kept crossing state lines, which caused problems because different police departments had to work together. Back in 1984, before computers and cell phones, sharing information between states meant making phone calls, mailing documents, and meeting face-to-face. The victims were different ages, from a 7-year-old child to a 77-year-old man. Some were killed because they had cars the couple wanted. Others just seemed to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Some were people who had been kind to the couple, giving them food, a place to stay, or just friendly conversation. The fact that Coleman and Brown would hurt people who helped them made it especially hard for communities to understand. Alton Coleman was 28 years old when the killing started. Police in his hometown of Waukegan, Illinois, had known about him for more than 10 years. He had been charged with violent crimes many times, but he was good at acting innocent in court. Most of the time, he was found not guilty, or the charges were dropped instead of him going to prison. People who dealt with him in court said he was smart and convincing. He could talk well and make juries doubt he did anything wrong, even when the evidence looked strong. Debra Brown was 21 years old and had never been in trouble with the law before she met Coleman. She was born and raised in the same Illinois city as him. People who knew her said she lived a normal, quiet life. She was one of 11 children in her family. She had hurt her head badly as a child, and it affected how her brain worked. Doctors who tested her later said her IQ showed she had thinking problems. Her mind worked slower than most people her age. She had been engaged to marry another man when she met Coleman in 1983, but she left that man and her family to be with Coleman. The question of why someone who had never been violent before would take part in such terrible crimes would become important in court later. But in the summer of 1984, while the crimes were still happening, police had a more pressing worry: finding Coleman and Brown and stopping them before they hurt anyone else. 18 years later, on April 26, 2002, Alton Coleman was tied down on a bed inside Ohio's death room at a prison in Lucasville. At 10:13 in the morning, after saying the same prayer over and over, he was killed by poison injection. He was 46 years old. He had been sentenced to death 4 times by 3 different states, twice by Ohio, once by Indiana, and once by Illinois. He was the only person in America at that time who had been sentenced to death by 3 states. Even at the very end, he said he didn't kill Marlene Walters. He tried to blame Debra Brown, still lying in his final moments. Debra Brown did not get executed. Her Ohio death sentence was changed to life in prison with no chance of getting out in 1991. The governor at the time, Richard Celeste, said it was because her IQ was so low and because experts said Coleman completely controlled her like a master controls a slave. She is still locked up at Dayton Correctional Institution in Ohio. She is now in her 60s and will stay in prison until she dies. Prison workers say she has been a good prisoner who has said she's sorry for what happened, but the victims' families have never gotten apologies directly from her. People still argue about whether Brown should be blamed. Was she a willing partner who chose to do horrible, violent things? Or was Coleman so completely in control of her, and was her mind so slow, that she couldn't really choose between right and wrong on her own? Nobody agrees on the answer, and people who knew the case and people who study it are still divided. But before the trials, before the death sentences, before the 18 years of appeals and the questions that people still ask today, there was the summer of 1984. There were 8 people living their normal lives who never came home. There were families torn apart and whole communities scared. There were investigators working day and night to catch killers they couldn't find. The story of what happened that summer starts not with the crimes themselves, but with the people who did them. If you're drawn to stories of justice, betrayal, and the people who reach a point of no return, make sure to subscribe to No Way Out. This is where true crime meets truth. Real cases, real consequences. The darkest corners of human decision, broken down into tiny pieces so you can see every detail and make your own conclusions better. Alton Coleman entered the world on November 6, 1955, in Waukegan, Illinois, a city located about 40 miles north of Chicago along Lake Michigan. The circumstances of his birth and early childhood were marked by instability and neglect. His mother worked multiple jobs to support herself and was involved in situations that exposed young Alton to adult behaviors and environments no child should witness. His grandmother, who lived in the same house, became his primary caregiver. According to those who knew the family, the home environment was chaotic. Robert Evans, a minister who knew Coleman from infancy, would later describe the conditions as involving exposure to drug use, prostitution, and various forms of abuse. The household was not a place where a child could develop a sense of safety or normal social bonds. Even in early childhood, Coleman struggled with peers. Other children teased him, sometimes cruelly. He reportedly had issues with bedwetting that persisted beyond the age when most children outgrow this, which led to a nickname that followed him through his school years. These social difficulties, combined with the unstable home life, contributed to his increasingly antisocial behavior as he grew older. By his teenage years, Coleman had aligned himself with a local street gang. He dropped out of school in 9th grade, never completing his formal education. He did not maintain regular employment throughout his adult life, instead supporting himself through a combination of odd jobs and illegal activities. Those who encountered him in these years noted that despite his lack of formal education, he was articulate and could be charming when he chose to be. His first known violent crime occurred on December 27, 1973, when he was 18 years old. Along with an accomplice, he abducted a 54-year-old woman at gunpoint. They took her to a remote location where Coleman raped her, then stole money from her vehicle. The crime resulted in charges, but through plea negotiations, the rape charges were dropped. Coleman pleaded guilty to armed robbery and served 3 years in prison. This would be his only significant prison time before the 1984 spree. After his release, Coleman's pattern of behavior continued. In 1976, while incarcerated on other charges, he was accused of sexually assaulting 3 fellow inmates. These charges resulted only in a battery conviction and a 6-month sentence. The gap between the severity of the accusations and the relatively minor consequences would repeat itself multiple times over the next several years. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Coleman was charged with various offenses involving violence and sexual assault. Court records show he was charged in 1980 with raping a member of the U.S. Navy. But he was acquitted. In 1982, he was considered a suspect in the rape and murder of a 15-year-old girl, but no charges were filed. In 1983, his own half-sister reported that he had molested his 8-year-old niece on 2 separate occasions, but the case was dismissed due to what prosecutors termed insufficient evidence. Each time charges were brought, Coleman managed to avoid serious consequences. Prosecutors and police who dealt with him noted his ability to present himself well in court. He spoke clearly, maintained appropriate demeanor, and seemed to convince juries that the accusations against him were either exaggerated or false. This pattern created a situation where, despite numerous accusations of serious violent crimes, Coleman remained free and continued to offend. By early 1984, Coleman faced a new charge. On February 26, 1984, Alton Coleman was walking through a neighborhood in North Chicago when he struck up a conversation with a woman named Dorothea Thompson. Coleman had developed this approach over years of offending. He would target mothers, engage them in friendly conversation, present himself as someone trustworthy and respectable. He would talk about religion, about community, about whatever topics seemed to resonate with his targets. He was skilled at reading people and adjusting his presentation to what they wanted to hear. Dorothea Thompson saw no reason to be suspicious. Coleman seemed polite and well-spoken. The conversation was pleasant. She had no way of knowing about his criminal history, about the multiple accusations of sexual assault that had followed him through the previous decade. They talked, and Coleman left. It seemed like nothing more than a brief encounter with a stranger. 2 days later, on February 28th, Coleman returned. This time he asked about Dorothea's daughter, Shalandra, who was 14 years old. The exact pretext Coleman used is not fully documented in court records, but he managed to gain access to the teenager when her mother was not present. Once alone with Shalandra, Coleman's demeanor changed completely. He produced a knife and threatened the girl with it. He raped her at knife point. The attack was violent and traumatic. When it was over, Coleman left, but Shalandra was able to identify him. She told her mother what had happened. Dorothea immediately contacted police and filed a report. This time, unlike some of Coleman's previous offenses, the evidence was strong and the victim's testimony was clear and consistent. Police arrested Coleman and charged him with rape. The Cook County State's Attorney's Office pursued the case aggressively. Prosecutors felt confident they had sufficient evidence for a conviction. A court date was set for May 30th, 1984. Coleman was released on bail pending trial, a decision that would have devastating consequences. As the trial date approached, Coleman understood his situation was different this time. In 1973, he had been convicted of armed robbery in connection with a rape, but plea negotiations had resulted in the rape charge being dropped. In 1976, accusations of raping fellow inmates had resulted only in a battery conviction. In 1980, he had been acquitted of rape charges. His pattern had always been to avoid serious consequences through legal maneuvering, jury persuasion, or prosecutorial decisions not to pursue cases. But the Shalandra Thompson case was strong. The victim could identify him clearly. She could describe the attack in detail. Physical evidence supported her account. Coleman had no alibi. His previous success at avoiding convictions may have made him overconfident, but it appears he recognized that this time conviction was likely, and a rape conviction would mean significant prison time. By early 1984, Coleman was living with Debra Brown in his grandmother's home in Waukegan. Brown had moved in with him sometime in 1983. leaving behind her engagement to another man and distancing herself from her family. She helped care for Coleman's elderly grandmother, who was in her 70s and needed assistance with daily activities. To outside observers, it might have appeared that Coleman was settling into a stable domestic situation. But those who knew his history understood that stability was not part of Coleman's pattern. On May 29, 1984, the day before Coleman's scheduled court appearance, Coleman made a decision. Rather than face trial, he would run. But he would not run alone, he would run with Debra. They both traveled from Waukegan, Illinois to Kenosha, Wisconsin. Kenosha is just across the state line, about 15 miles north of Waukegan. It was close enough to be familiar territory, but far enough to be a different jurisdiction. Coleman was not traveling under his own name. He had adopted a false identity, calling himself Robert Knight. In Kenosha, Coleman encountered Juanita Wheat. She was a mother living in the city, working to support her family. She had a daughter named Vernita, who was 9 years old. Vernita was in 4th grade, doing well in school, a child with her whole life ahead of her. May was near the end of the school year, and summer vacation was approaching. Coleman approached Juanita and engaged her in conversation. He used the same techniques that had worked on Dorothea Thompson and countless others. He was friendly, charming, interested in Juanita's life. He asked about her family. He presented himself as someone who wanted to help, someone who could be trusted. Juanita, like Dorothea, had no reason to suspect danger. Over the course of their conversation, Coleman mentioned something about getting a gift for Juanita. The exact details of what he promised are not fully clear from court records, but the result was that Juanita agreed to allow Vernita to go with Coleman. Vernita went with Coleman willingly. She had no reason to fear. Her mother had spoken with this man. He seemed nice. She was a child who trusted adults, particularly when her mother seemed to approve. Coleman walked away from Juanita's presence with Vernita beside him. Coleman took Vernita across the state line, from Wisconsin back to Illinois to Waukegan. He took her to an abandoned building in a neighborhood he knew well, just 4 blocks from where his grandmother lived. What happened in that building was not witnessed by anyone who survived to testify. The forensic evidence tells part of the story. Vernita was sexually assaulted and then strangled to death using a ligature, some type of cord or similar object that was tightened around her neck until she suffocated. Coleman left Vernita's body in the abandoned building. He did not attempt to hide it or dispose of it in a way that would delay discovery. He simply left the 9-year-old child's body there and walked away. May 29th turned to May 30th. On May 30th, Coleman did not appear in court for his trial on the Chalandra Thompson rape charge. A warrant was issued for his arrest for failure to appear. But by then, Coleman and Brown were already planning their next moves. Back in Kenosha, Juanita Wheat waited for her daughter to return. When Vernita did not come home, Juanita contacted police. She reported her daughter missing. She told police about the man who called himself Robert Knight, about allowing Vernita to go with him. Police began searching for the missing child, but Coleman had already taken her across state lines, which complicated the investigation. The FBI would eventually become involved because of the interstate nature of the abduction, but initially it was treated as a local missing child case. Days passed. Vernita's absence stretched from hours to days to weeks. Juanita held out hope that her daughter would be found alive, that perhaps she had been taken but not harmed, that somehow she would come home. Missing person flyers were distributed. News coverage in the local area asked for information about Vernita's whereabouts. On June 19, 1984, 3 weeks after Vernita's disappearance, someone discovered her body in the abandoned building in Waukegan. The decomposition was severe. The summer heat had accelerated the natural processes of decay. The condition of the body made the investigation more difficult, but medical examiners were able to determine the cause of death: ligature strangulation. They also determined that the child had been sexually assaulted before being killed. Police in Waukegan began investigating the murder. They processed the crime scene, collected evidence, and tried to identify the victim. Through dental records and other identifying information, they confirmed that the body was Vernita Wheat, the child who had been reported missing from Kenosha 3 weeks earlier. They notified Kenosha police and the FBI. Juanita Wheat received the news every parent dreads. Her daughter was not coming home. The man she had trusted, the man who had called himself Robert Knight, had taken her daughter across state lines, raped her, murdered her, and left her body in an abandoned building. But by June 19th, when Vernita's body was found, Alton Coleman and Debra Brown had already left a trail of additional victims across multiple states. The 9-year-old girl from Kenosha was not their last victim. She was their first, and they were just getting started. To understand how Debra Brown became involved in the crimes that followed, we need to look at who she was before she met Alton Coleman. Her story stands in sharp contrast to Coleman's, which makes her participation in the violence all the more difficult for many to comprehend. Debra Denise Brown was born on November 11, 1962, in Waukegan, Illinois. Unlike Coleman's chaotic upbringing, Debra came from what appeared on the surface to be a stable family. She was one of 11 children, growing up in a household that, while crowded, was intact. Her mother and father were both present in the home, and by most accounts the family maintained normal community ties. However, court records and psychological evaluations conducted years later would reveal that the home environment had serious problems. Debra's father suffered from mental health issues that were severe and apparently untreated. He drank heavily, and his drinking led to violence. He was physically abusive toward family members, including the children. The household that looked stable from the outside was actually a place where children experienced fear and harm. When Debra was still young, she suffered a traumatic head injury. The exact circumstances of this injury are not fully documented in available records, but the effects were significant and lasting. The injury affected her cognitive development. As she grew older, it became clear that she functioned at a level below her peers. In school, she struggled academically. Testing conducted in later years would show her IQ range between 59 and 74, depending on the assessment, placing her in the category of borderline intellectual disability. In 1980, when Debra was 18, she experienced a drug overdose that required hospitalization. After recovering from the overdose, she continued living in Waukegan. In 1983, Debra met Alton Coleman. She was 21 years old. He was 28. Despite being engaged to another man, Debra made the decision to leave her fiancé, leave her family, and move in with Coleman. She went to live with him in his grandmother's home, where she helped provide care for the elderly woman. The speed with which Debra abandoned her previous life to be with Coleman raised questions among those who knew her. Her family was troubled by the change, but did not know how to intervene. The man she had been engaged to was left without clear explanation. Friends found themselves cut off as Debra withdrew from her previous social connections. So in May 1984, when Coleman decided to flee rather than face his court date, Debra went with him without hesitation. Whether she understood what they were about to do remains a matter of debate. What is not debatable is what happened next. On June 18, 1984, in the Glen Park neighborhood of Gary, Indiana, 2 young girls were running an errand for their family. 9-year-old Annie Hillard and her 7-year-old niece, Tamika Turks, were walking together when they encountered Alton Coleman and Debra Brown. The adults approached the children in a friendly manner. They spoke to the girls, and according to later testimony, they promised to buy them toys or treats if they would come with them. Annie and Tamika had no reason to fear the couple. Children in the neighborhood were used to seeing various adults around, and the presence of Debra Brown, a woman, may have made the invitation seem less threatening. The girls agreed to go with Coleman and Brown. They walked together to a location away from the main street, to a place where they would not be easily seen. What happened next was violent and deliberate. Both girls were sexually assaulted. The attacks were brutal. Annie suffered injuries so severe that her intestines protruded into her vaginal cavity. Tamika was strangled with an elastic strip torn from a bedsheet. The same type of fabric was later found in the apartment where Coleman and Brown had been staying. Annie, despite her catastrophic injuries, survived. After the attack, she managed to crawl toward a road where someone might see her. She was found and rushed to a hospital, where doctors worked to save her life and repair the damage. She would survive physically, though the psychological trauma would last far longer than her physical recovery. Tamika was not as fortunate. Her small body was found in the bushes near where the attack had occurred. The ligature strangulation had killed her. She was 7 years old. Her mother, Laverne Turks, received the news that would forever divide her life into before and after that June day. On that same day, June 18th, another woman disappeared from Gary. Donna Williams, who was 25 years old, was abducted by Coleman and Brown. Like the other victims, she was sexually assaulted and strangled with a ligature. Her body would not be discovered for several weeks. When it was finally found in Detroit, Michigan, more than 100 miles away, the decomposition was advanced. The fact that her body was in Michigan, while she had disappeared from Indiana, demonstrated the couple's mobility and their willingness to cross state lines to dispose of evidence. The 3 crimes in Gary on a single day represented an escalation. Coleman had already killed Vernita Wheat in Wisconsin and Illinois, but that murder had occurred nearly 3 weeks before her body was found, which meant Coleman and Brown had continued their activities while authorities were still unaware a child had been killed. The Gary crimes were different. They were multiple violent acts in one location in a short time period. The couple was becoming bolder and more reckless. After leaving Gary, Coleman and Brown needed a new vehicle. They had been using one Robert Carpenter's stolen car, but they knew that vehicle was now linked to missing persons reports and possibly to evidence at crime scenes. Keeping it would make them easier to track. They needed something else, and they needed to keep moving. Their next stop would be Detroit, Michigan, where they would begin a new pattern: entering homes, gaining trust or forcing entry, beating occupants, and stealing cars. The violence was no longer limited to vulnerable children. Now they were willing to attack anyone who had something they wanted. Coleman and Brown arrived in Detroit in late June 1984. The choice of Detroit made strategic sense for them. It was a large city where 2 people could blend into crowds more easily than in smaller towns. It was also a place where car theft was common enough that one more stolen vehicle might not immediately trigger a major investigation. The couple needed to keep moving and keep changing their transportation. On June 28th, Coleman and Brown targeted a home in Dearborn Heights, a suburb of Detroit. The residents were Palmer Jones, who was 62, and his wife, Marjorie, who was 59. The couple had lived in their home for years and had no reason to expect danger when someone knocked on their door. Coleman and Brown forced their way into the Jones home. They beat both Palmer and Marjorie, using enough force to incapacitate them, but in this case, not to kill them. Coleman ripped the telephone from the wall, ensuring the victims could not immediately call for help. The attackers took money from the home and, most importantly, took the Jones family car. They left the couple injured and traumatized, but alive. The Jones attack demonstrated a slight change in method. Rather than killing everyone they encountered, Coleman and Brown were now sometimes leaving victims alive if they got what they needed quickly. This was not mercy. Several future victims would also be left alive, but this was rather pragmatism. They observed dead bodies, brought more police attention than robbery and assault. If they could get a car and cash and leave before anyone could identify them or stop them, that served their purposes. While in the Detroit area, Coleman and Brown committed other crimes that have been documented in police reports, but were not prosecuted due to the volume of more serious charges they eventually faced. They robbed other individuals. Donna Williams's body was eventually found in Detroit, about half a mile from where her stolen car was recovered. She had been the Gary victim, whose body was transported across state lines. The discovery of her remains in Detroit helped investigators begin to piece together the couple's movements and confirmed that they were traveling through multiple states. By early July, Law enforcement agencies in Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, and Michigan were all aware that someone was committing violent crimes across the Midwest, but coordination between these agencies was still developing. Before the widespread use of computers and instant communication, sharing information across state lines required physical meetings, phone calls, and mailed documents. The investigation was always one step behind the perpetrators. Coleman and Brown did not stay in Detroit long. By early July, they were on the move again, this time heading east toward Ohio. They had already killed at least 4 people: Vernita Wheat, Tamika Turks, Donna Williams, and potentially others. They had assaulted numerous others, they had stolen multiple vehicles, and they were showing no signs of stopping. Their arrival in Ohio would mark the deadliest phase of their crime spree. On July 5, 1984, Coleman and Brown arrived in Toledo, Ohio, a city on the western edge of Lake Erie, near the Michigan border. Their pattern had become consistent by this point. Arrive in a new city, identify potential victims who had something they needed, and take it by force. In Toledo, they would claim 2 more lives in a single attack. Virginia Temple lived with several of her children in a home in Toledo. She was 30 years old. Her daughter, Rochelle, was about 10 years old, depending on which sources you consult. The family lived in a working-class neighborhood where people generally knew their neighbors and felt relatively safe. Coleman had a particular talent for gaining the trust of mothers. He would strike up conversations, present himself as friendly and harmless, and create opportunities to get closer to families. In Virginia Temple's case, he succeeded in befriending her. The exact nature of their initial contact is not fully documented, but by July 5th, Coleman and Brown had gained access to the Temple home. Once inside, the couple attacked. Both Virginia and Rochelle were sexually assaulted. Both were then strangled. Their bodies were hidden in a crawlspace beneath the home, which meant they were not immediately discovered. The delay in finding the bodies gave Coleman and Brown time to put more distance between themselves and the crime scene. From the Temple home, Coleman and Brown took items including jewelry. This jewelry would later become a critical piece of evidence because Coleman kept it, and pieces of it were found at subsequent crime scenes. One particular bracelet that had belonged to Virginia Temple would be found weeks later underneath the body of another victim in Cincinnati, establishing a direct link between crimes in different cities. On the same morning that Virginia and Rochelle Temple were killed, Coleman and Brown were not finished in Toledo. They went to another home, that of Frank and Dorothy Duvendak. The Duvendaks were bound with electrical cords, a method that Coleman would use repeatedly. The couple's car was stolen, along with money and other items. Dorothy Duvendak's watch was taken, and like the jewelry from the Temple home, this watch would later surface at another crime scene. The Duvendaks survived, though they were left bound and helpless in their home. Eventually, they were able to free themselves or were found by someone who could help them. They provided descriptions of their attackers to police, adding to the growing profile that law enforcement was building of the 2 suspects who seemed to be terrorizing the Midwest. The Toledo crimes represented a new level of violence. 2 people were dead in one home. Another couple was assaulted and robbed in their home. Both attacks occurred on the same day. Coleman and Brown were becoming more aggressive and more reckless. The gap between crimes was shrinking. They were spending less time in each location and moving more frequently. After leaving Toledo, the couple drove south toward Dayton, Ohio. They needed a place to stay, and they found one through an encounter that demonstrated just how effectively Coleman could present himself as someone trustworthy. In Dayton, they would meet an elderly minister and his wife who would make a decision they would come to regret. The minister, Reverend Millard Gay, was 79 years old in the summer of 1984. His wife, Catherine, was 77. The couple had devoted their lives to religious service and community work in Dayton, Ohio. They were the kind of people who believed in helping others, in offering hospitality to those who seemed to need it. This fundamental decency made them vulnerable to someone like Alton Coleman. Coleman encountered the Gays in early July, shortly after the Toledo murders. He presented himself as a religious person, someone interested in faith and spiritual matters. He engaged Reverend Gay in conversation about religion and scripture. Coleman was articulate and could speak knowledgeably about religious topics when he chose to. The minister found him engaging. Coleman introduced Debra Brown as his girlfriend, and the couple asked if they might stay with the Gays for a short time. Reverend Gay and Catherine agreed. They opened their home to Coleman and Brown, giving them a place to sleep and providing them with meals. On July 9th, Coleman and Brown even accompanied the Gays to a religious service. To outside observers, they would have appeared to be a young couple being mentored by an elderly religious leader and his wife. On July 10th, the Gays drove Coleman and Brown to downtown Cincinnati and dropped them off. The couple had told the Gays they had somewhere to be, and the minister and his wife saw no reason to doubt them. They said their goodbyes and drove back to Dayton. They had no way of knowing what Coleman and Brown were about to do in Cincinnati, or that they would see the couple again, under very different circumstances. In Cincinnati, on July 12th, a 15-year-old girl named Toni Story disappeared. She was a student who had been walking to summer classes. She lived in the Over-the-Rhine neighborhood, an area of Cincinnati that at that time was economically struggling. Toni was young, African-American, and came from a family that did not have significant resources to immediately launch a massive private search. Toni's body was not found immediately. She had been taken to an abandoned building, sexually assaulted, and strangled. When her body was discovered 8 days later, on July 20th, the decomposition made the investigation more difficult. But there was a crucial piece of evidence. Underneath Toni's body, investigators found a bracelet that had belonged to Virginia Temple, the woman killed in Toledo. This directly connected the Cincinnati murder to the Toledo murders and helped authorities understand they were tracking people who were moving across state lines and leaving a consistent pattern. The day Toni Story disappeared, July 12, 1984, the FBI made a significant announcement. They were adding Alton Coleman to the 10 most wanted list, but not in a normal way. The list typically has 10 names, but the FBI created what they called a special edition, an 11th spot, specifically for Coleman. This designation was reserved for fugitives who were actively dangerous and likely to continue committing violent crimes. Only a handful of people in the history of the list had received this designation. The FBI's announcement meant that Coleman's photograph and information were distributed to law enforcement agencies nationwide. It also meant that the media began covering the story more intensely. By mid-July 1984, Coleman and Brown were front-page news across the Midwest. Their faces were on television. The public was warned to be on the lookout. Tips began coming in to police departments, though many of these tips would prove to be false sightings or cases of mistaken identity. Despite the increased attention, Coleman and Brown continued moving. Their next stop would prove to be the most brutal attack yet, and it would leave behind evidence that would eventually seal their fate. On the morning of July 13, 1984, Coleman and Brown arrived in Norwood, Ohio, a small city that is essentially surrounded by Cincinnati. They were riding bicycles they had stolen earlier. The choice to use bicycles rather than a car may have been strategic. Two people on bikes draw less attention than people in a vehicle that might have been reported stolen. As they rode through a quiet residential neighborhood on Floral Avenue, they noticed a camping trailer parked in a driveway with a for sale sign attached to it. The trailer belonged to Harry and Marlene Walters, a married couple in their 40s. Harry was 45 and worked in construction. He was on vacation that week. Marlene was 44 and worked as a part-time librarian and Sunday school teacher. They had 3 children, and their 19-year-old daughter, Sherry, still lived with them. Coleman and Brown stopped at the house and knocked on the door. When Harry Walters answered, they asked about the camping trailer. Harry was happy to discuss it. He and Marlene invited the couple onto their porch, where they sat and talked. Neighbors later reported seeing the 4 of them sitting on the porch for an extended period, drinking what appeared to be coffee or lemonade. Nothing about the scene suggested danger. It looked like two couples having a friendly conversation on a summer morning. The conversation flowed easily. Coleman was displaying the charm that had served him so well throughout his criminal career. A police commander in Norwood would later say, "He has a way of getting next to people. He can talk his way into the home. He meets people on the street, and he can discuss religion. He can discuss politics. He's very forward, very well-spoken, very calm." Harry and Marlene had no reason to suspect that the polite young couple on their porch had killed 6 people in the previous 6 weeks. Eventually, Harry and Marlene invited Coleman and Brown inside the house to continue discussing the trailer sale. They moved from the porch to the living room. Harry told Coleman he would need to go upstairs to find the title for the camper so they could complete the transaction. Harry excused himself and went up to the second floor to locate the paperwork. The moment Harry left the room, the situation changed. Coleman and Brown were alone with Marlene in the living room. Coleman picked up a heavy wooden candlestick holder that was on display. It was approximately 4 feet long and substantial enough to be used as a weapon. Without warning, Coleman began attacking Marlene with the candlestick. He struck her in the head repeatedly. The blows came one after another with brutal force. Marlene had no chance to defend herself or escape. The candlestick crushed her skull. Coleman hit her at least 20 to 25 times, according to the coroner's later examination. Her face was mutilated, her scalp was torn. The violence was extreme and sustained, indicating an intent not just to incapacitate, but to inflict maximum damage. While this attack was occurring, Harry was upstairs searching through papers for the title. He heard nothing that alarmed him. Perhaps the house's construction muffled sounds. Perhaps the attack happened so quickly that Marlene had no opportunity to scream. Whatever the reason, Harry continued looking for the paperwork, unaware that his wife was being beaten to death 1 floor below him. When Harry came back downstairs with the title in hand, he walked into a scene of horror. His wife was on the floor, grievously injured or already dead. Before Harry could fully process what he was seeing or react, Coleman turned on him. Coleman swung the candlestick and struck Harry on the back of the head with tremendous force. The blow shattered what remained of the candlestick and drove a piece of Harry's skull into his brain. Harry collapsed, unconscious. But Coleman was not finished with Harry. While Harry lay unconscious on the floor, Coleman stabbed him in the abdomen. The attack was meant to ensure that Harry would not survive to identify his attackers. Coleman and Brown then began binding both victims. They tied electrical cords around the victim's feet. They placed handcuffs on Harry's wrists behind his back. They bound Marlene's hands behind her back as well. They put ligatures around both victims' throats. Coleman and Brown dragged or carried the victims to the basement. They left them at the bottom of the basement stairs, both bound and helpless. Marlene was already dead or dying from the massive head trauma. Harry was unconscious and severely injured, but still breathing, though barely. The attackers then ransacked the house. They took cash from wherever they could find it. They took jewelry, including pieces that Marlene wore regularly. They took shoes that fit them. They searched through the house looking for anything of value. They found the keys to the Walters' red Plymouth Reliant and took those as well. Before leaving, Coleman and Brown left behind the bicycles they had ridden to the house. They also left clothing and shoes they had been wearing. These items would later provide forensic evidence linking them to the crime scene. But in the moment, their priority was getting away quickly in the stolen car. They left through the front door, got into the Plymouth Reliant, and drove away. The entire sequence from the time they knocked on the door to the time they drove away had taken approximately 3 hours. From the outside, nothing appeared unusual. A car leaving a driveway in the middle of a Friday morning was not something that would draw attention from neighbors. Sherry Walters finished her shift at work and drove home at approximately 3:45 that afternoon. She pulled into the driveway and entered the house through the front door. She immediately sensed something was wrong. There was blood visible in the living room. She called out for her parents, but received no answer. She moved through the house and found the basement door open. She looked down the basement stairs and saw her parents lying at the bottom. Both were covered in blood. She could see that they were bound. She rushed down the stairs. Her mother was clearly dead, a bloody sheet covering her head. Her father was barely breathing, his injuries severe and obvious. Sherry called for emergency help. Police and ambulances arrived within minutes. Paramedics worked to stabilize Harry Walters. His injuries were critical. The piece of skull driven into his brain was causing ongoing damage. The stab wound to his abdomen was serious. His blood loss was significant. They transported him to a hospital immediately, where doctors began emergency surgery to save his life. Marlene Walters was pronounced dead at the scene. The coroner's examination would later detail the extent of her injuries. At least 20 to 25 blows to the head, crushing of the skull, severe damage to the face and scalp. The attack had been sustained and violent, far beyond what was necessary to cause death. It suggested rage or a desire to inflict maximum suffering. Police processed the crime scene. They found blood spattered throughout the living room and basement. They found shattered glass from the candlestick holder and from bottles that had been broken during the struggle. On one piece of glass, they found a clear fingerprint. They collected the fingerprint and sent it for analysis. They also found bloody footprints on the floor, made by 2 different pairs of shoes. The prints showed that 2 people had been present during the attack. They found the bicycles that had been left behind and collected them as evidence. They found clothing and shoes that did not belong to the Walters family. They documented everything, photographing the scene from multiple angles, collecting samples, preserving evidence that would later be used in court. Within 24 hours, the FBI had matched the fingerprint found on the broken glass to Alton Coleman. His prints were in the system from his previous arrests. The identification was certain. Police now knew who had attacked the Walters family. They issued bulletins to law enforcement agencies across the region. The manhunt intensified. Harry Walters remained in the hospital for 3 months. The surgeons worked to repair the damage to his skull and brain as much as possible, but the injury was permanent. He would survive, but he would never be the same. His memory of that day ended with Coleman asking about the candlestick. Everything after that moment was gone, erased by the trauma to his brain. The attack on the Walters family was different from Coleman and Brown's previous crimes in several ways. It occurred in broad daylight in a residential neighborhood. The victims had invited the attackers into their home and shown them hospitality. The level of violence was extreme, even by the standards of Coleman's previous murders. And Marlene Walters was white, the first white victim in a series of crimes that had previously targeted only African Americans. The racial aspect of the crimes would later become a subject of discussion and analysis. Were Coleman and Brown targeting African American victims specifically, either out of hatred or because they found it easier to blend into African American communities? Or was the pattern simply a result of the neighborhoods where they traveled and the people they encountered? The answer remains unclear. But the murder of Marlene Walters demonstrated that Coleman and Brown were willing to attack anyone who had something they wanted, regardless of race. The red Plymouth Reliant stolen from the Walters home was found abandoned 2 days later in a cornfield near Lexington, Kentucky, about 80 miles south of Cincinnati. Coleman and Brown had driven to Kentucky, but they needed a new vehicle. In Lexington, on July 16, 1984, they found their next victim. Oline Carmichael Jr. was either 45 or 33 years old, depending on which source you consult. He was a college professor of political science at a school in Williamsburg, Kentucky. He was walking to his vehicle in a parking lot when Coleman and Brown approached him. They were armed with a gun. Coleman and Brown forced Carmichael into his own car and drove him away from the area. They did not kill him immediately, which was a departure from their pattern with some other victims. Instead, they kept him as they drove. Their destination was Dayton, Ohio, back north, away from Lexington. They were returning to the city where they had stayed with Reverend Gay and his wife. At some point during the drive, Coleman and Brown placed Carmichael in the trunk of his own car and locked him inside. They continued driving with him, trapped in the trunk. When they reached Dayton, they abandoned the vehicle with Carmichael still inside. He was found by authorities still alive, though he had been locked in the trunk for a significant period. The summer heat in a car trunk could have killed him, but he survived. Carmichael was able to provide investigators with descriptions of Coleman and Brown and details about his abduction. This added to the growing body of evidence about the couple's methods and their movements. The fact that he had been taken in Kentucky and transported to Ohio reinforced the pattern of crossing state lines. After abandoning Carmichael's car, Coleman and Brown went back to the home of Reverend Gay and his wife. This time, they did not pretend to be seeking spiritual guidance. When Reverend Gay answered the door and saw them, he recognized them from news reports. He knew who they were. He asked Coleman, "Why you want to do us like that, like this?" According to Reverend Gay's later testimony, Coleman replied, "I'm not going to kill you, but we generally kill them where we go." This statement, if accurate, was a rare moment of Coleman speaking directly about his actions. It suggested both an awareness of what he and Brown were doing and a certain pride, or at least acknowledgement of the violence they had committed. Coleman and Brown then attacked the elderly couple. Reverend Gay was pistol-whipped with the gun Coleman carried. Both he and Catherine were tied up. Coleman attempted to strangle Catherine, but the attempt was unsuccessful. He then tried to shoot her, but the gun malfunctioned. Coleman and Brown stole money from the Gays and took their car, a station wagon. They left the couple bound in their home, but alive. Eventually, the Gays were able to free themselves and contact police. They provided detailed information about the attack and described the vehicle that had been stolen. This car would be found later at a car wash in Indianapolis, abandoned after Coleman and Brown had used it to travel to their next target. From Dayton, Coleman and Brown drove west toward Indianapolis, Indiana, using the station wagon stolen from Reverend and Mrs. Gay. Indianapolis is Indiana's capital and largest city, located roughly in the center of the state. Coleman and Brown arrived there on July 19, 1984. In Indianapolis, they encountered Eugene Scott. Scott was an elderly man living alone. Coleman and Brown targeted him for his vehicle. The attack on Scott was particularly brutal. He was shot multiple times and stabbed repeatedly. His body was found in a ditch near Zionsville, a suburb north of Indianapolis. Scott's car was stolen and became the couple's transportation for their final journey. They drove the stolen vehicle north and east, back toward the area where their crime spree had begun 2 months earlier. They were heading to Evanston, Illinois, a suburb directly north of Chicago, very close to their hometown of Waukegan. The decision to return to the Chicago area was tactically questionable. By this point, Coleman and Brown were the subjects of a massive manhunt. Their photographs had been shown repeatedly on television. Newspapers across the Midwest had published their pictures and descriptions. The FBI had elevated Coleman to special fugitive status. Every law enforcement agency in multiple states was looking for them. Returning to an area where people might recognize Coleman from his years growing up there seemed like a significant risk. But perhaps Coleman felt he had no better options. He and Brown had been moving constantly for almost 2 months. They were exhausted. They had little money. Every car they stole was quickly identified and reported. Every time they attacked someone and left them alive, another witness added to the growing profile. Law enforcement was building. The net was closing around them. Coleman may also have felt a pull toward familiar territory. Despite having spent his adult life committing crimes in and around Waukegan, it was still home. He knew the streets, knew the neighborhoods, knew where he could potentially hide. Brown, too, had grown up in the area and might have felt some sense of returning to known ground, even as they became the most wanted fugitives in the region. On July 20, 1984, Coleman and Brown were in Evanston. They were on foot in Mason Park. Coleman had changed his appearance somewhat, but not enough. As they moved through the park, they crossed in front of a car. The driver of that car was someone from Coleman's past, someone who had known him growing up in Waukegan. The driver recognized him. Rather than confronting Coleman directly, the driver left the area and immediately contacted police. He provided information about where Coleman and Brown were located and what they were wearing. Police responded quickly. Officers moved into the park area. Brown attempted to leave the park and was stopped at an exit point. A search of her handbag revealed a loaded gun. Coleman was approached by officers. When asked to identify himself, he initially denied being Alton Coleman, but he did not resist arrest. The officers took both suspects into custody without incident. A search of their belongings revealed disguises, multiple changes of clothing, and other items consistent with people who were trying to change their appearance frequently. They had a knife that still had traces of blood on it. They were arrested and taken to Evanston Police Headquarters. Fingerprint analysis confirmed their identities beyond any doubt. Near where they were arrested, police found Eugene Scott's stolen car. The vehicle linked them directly to the Indianapolis murder. Inside the car or on the couple's persons, police found items stolen from various victims. Jewelry taken from Virginia Temple in Toledo. Dorothy Duvendak's watch from Toledo. Items from other victims. Each piece of evidence was a link in a chain that connected Coleman and Brown to crimes across 6 states. The capture brought relief to communities across the Midwest. For 53 days, Coleman and Brown had been moving freely, attacking people, stealing vehicles, and leaving death behind them. Now they were in custody. The immediate threat was over, but the legal process was just beginning. Within a week of the arrests, law enforcement officials from 6 states gathered for what was termed a summit meeting. More than 50 officials from various agencies met to discuss how to proceed with prosecution. This was an unusual situation. Coleman and Brown had committed crimes in Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, and Kentucky. Multiple jurisdictions had strong cases against them. The question was which state should prosecute first. The decision was not purely about which state had the strongest evidence. It was also about which state could move most quickly toward a death sentence. Federal authorities and prosecutors in the various states agreed that Coleman and Brown should receive the death penalty if possible. Given the number of victims, the violence of the crimes, and the extended nature of the spree, there was consensus that this was an appropriate case for capital punishment. Michigan was immediately ruled out because it does not have the death penalty. Wisconsin also does not have the death penalty, so the murder of Vernita Wheat, while it could be prosecuted there, would not result in a death sentence. That left Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Kentucky as possibilities. Kentucky had the kidnapping of Olin Carmichael, but no murders within its borders. Illinois had the murder of Vernita Wheat, but proving that case would be challenging because of the advanced decomposition of the body and the amount of time between the crime and the discovery. Indiana had the murder of Tamika Turks and the attempted murder of Annie Hillard, and these were strong cases with a surviving victim who could testify. Ohio had multiple murders: Tunny Story in Cincinnati, Marlene Walters in Norwood, and Virginia and Rochelle Temple in Toledo. U.S. Attorney Dan K. Webb made the recommendation that Ohio should prosecute first. He stated publicly, "We're convinced that prosecution in Ohio can most quickly and most likely result in the swiftest imposition of the death penalty against Alton Coleman and Debra Brown." The other states agreed to this approach. Ohio would go first, with other states holding their cases in reserve in case the Ohio prosecution failed or was overturned on appeal. The decision to prioritize speed to a death sentence over other considerations reveals the law enforcement and prosecutorial mindset of the time. Coleman and Brown were held on bond of $25 million for him and $20 million for her. These were the highest bonds ever set in the Northern District of Illinois at that time. U.S. Magistrate Carl Sussman stated when setting the bonds that Coleman had held the nation under a siege, under a reign of terror. The high bonds ensured that Coleman and Brown would remain in custody throughout the trial process. Ohio moved quickly to bring Coleman and Brown to trial. The state decided to prosecute them separately, which meant 2 trials with much of the same evidence presented twice. The first trial focused on the murders of Tunny Story and Marlene Walters. Both defendants would be tried for both murders, but in separate proceedings. The prosecution had significant evidence. In the Walters case, they had Harry Walters as a surviving witness who could testify about the attack. They had Coleman's fingerprints on broken glass at the crime scene. They had bloody footprints from 2 different pairs of shoes. They had items stolen from the Walters home that were found in Coleman and Brown's possession when they were arrested. They had the testimony of neighbors who saw Coleman and Brown at the Walters home on the day of the murder. In the Tawny Story case, they had the bracelet from Virginia Temple found under Tawny's body, linking the Cincinnati murder to the Toledo murder and establishing a pattern. They had evidence that Coleman and Brown were in Cincinnati at the time of Tawny's disappearance. They had testimony about the ligature strangulation, which was consistent with other murders attributed to the couple. Coleman's trial for the Walters murder began in June 1985. The jury selection process was extensive, as both sides sought jurors who could be fair, despite the extensive media coverage the case had received. The trial itself lasted several days and included testimony from dozens of witnesses. Harry Walters took the stand. He testified about inviting Coleman and Brown into his home, about discussing the camping trailer, about Coleman picking up the wooden candlestick. He testified about the last thing he remembered before losing consciousness. He described waking up in a hospital and learning that his wife was dead. His testimony was emotional and powerful. Sherry Walters testified about coming home from work and finding her parents at the bottom of the basement stairs, covered in blood. She described her mother's body and her father's condition. She talked about the horror of that discovery and the impact it had on her and her family. Medical examiners testified about the nature of Marlene Walters' injuries. They described the 20 to 25 blows to her head, the crushing of her skull, the mutilation of her face and scalp. They explained how the injuries would have caused death relatively quickly, though not instantaneously. They testified that the attack was sustained and violent, indicating an intent to cause maximum harm. Forensic experts testified about the fingerprints, the footprints, the stolen items, and the physical evidence that placed Coleman and Brown at the scene. They walked the jury through the evidence collection process and explained how each piece of evidence was linked to the defendants. The defense strategy was limited. Coleman's attorneys could not deny he had been at the Walters home. The physical evidence was too strong. Instead, they attempted to argue that while Coleman was present, Brown had actually killed Marlene Walters. This defense strategy was complicated by the fact that Brown, in her separate trial, would claim that she had killed Marlene Walters, apparently in an attempt to save Coleman from the death penalty. The jury deliberated for a relatively short time before returning a guilty verdict. Coleman was convicted of aggravated murder, attempted aggravated murder, aggravated robbery, and aggravated burglary. The case moved to the penalty phase, where the jury would decide whether Coleman should receive the death penalty. During the penalty phase, the prosecution presented evidence of Coleman's prior criminal history, including his previous rape conviction and the other violent crimes he had committed during the 1984 spree. They argued that he represented a continuing threat to society and that the aggravating circumstances of the crime, the brutality, the fact that it occurred during a robbery, the vulnerability of the victims who had invited him into their home, warranted the death penalty. The defense presented mitigating evidence. They called witnesses to testify about Coleman's troubled childhood, the abuse and neglect he had experienced, the environment in which he had been raised. They presented expert testimony about potential mental health issues. They argued that while he was guilty, execution was not the appropriate punishment. The jury recommended death. The judge agreed and formally sentenced Coleman to death. Coleman was also convicted in a separate proceeding for the murder of Tawny Story and received a second death sentence from Ohio. Debra Brown's trial followed a similar pattern in terms of evidence presented, but her defense strategy was significantly different from Coleman's. Her attorneys focused heavily on her intellectual disabilities, her dependent personality disorder, and what they characterized as her complete domination by Coleman. Dr. Saran, a psychologist who had evaluated Brown, testified as an expert witness. He explained that Brown's IQ testing placed her in the range of borderline intellectual disability. He testified about the head trauma she had suffered as a child and how that injury had affected her cognitive development. He explained the concept of dependent personality disorder and how someone with that condition might be particularly vulnerable to manipulation and control by a stronger personality. Dr. Saran stated his opinion that Brown had no independent capacity for the kind of violence she had participated in. He testified that in his professional judgment, she would never have committed these crimes without Coleman's influence. He characterized the relationship as master-slave, with Coleman as the completely dominant figure, and Brown as someone who followed his instructions without the ability to exercise independent judgment. Other experts testified about Brown's family background, the abuse in her childhood home, and the overall pattern of trauma and limitation that had defined her life before meeting Coleman. Character witnesses testified that before meeting Coleman, Brown had been quiet, law-abiding, and had never shown any signs of violence or aggression. The prosecution countered by presenting evidence that Brown had been an active participant in the crimes, not merely a passive follower. They noted that Brown had helped restrain victims, had helped search homes for valuables, had driven stolen cars, and had been present during multiple violent acts without attempting to escape or seek help. They argued that regardless of her limitations, she had made choices to continue participating in crimes even after it was clear what Coleman was doing. The jury found Brown guilty of murder in the Walters case. However, during the penalty phase, the jury did not recommend death. Instead, Brown was sentenced to life in prison. The jury appeared to have been persuaded that while she was guilty, her intellectual limitations and the nature of her relationship with Coleman made her less culpable than Coleman himself. Brown was also convicted in a separate trial for the murder of Tony Story. In that case, the jury did recommend death, and she was sentenced accordingly. So Brown faced one death sentence from Ohio and one life sentence. After the Ohio convictions, Coleman and Brown were transported to Indiana to face charges there. The Indiana prosecution focused on the murder of 7-year-old Tamika Turks and the attempted murder of 9-year-old Annie Hillard. The trial took place in Lake County, Indiana, in 1986. Annie Hillard, now a bit older but still a child, had to testify about what had happened to her. This was deeply traumatic for her and for her family. She had to describe being approached by Coleman and Brown, being taken to a secluded area, being sexually assaulted, and being left for dead. She had to identify Coleman and Brown in the courtroom as the people who had attacked her. The physical evidence in the Indiana case was strong. Medical testimony described the severity of Annie's injuries and explained how it was essentially miraculous that she had survived. Testimony about Tamika focused on the ligature strangulation and the elastic fabric from a bedsheet that had been used to choke her. That same type of fabric had been found in the apartment Coleman and Brown had been using. Laverne Turks, Tamika's mother, testified about her daughter, about the day she disappeared, about learning that her child had been murdered. Her testimony was heartbreaking and helped the jury understand the full impact of the crime on the victim's family. The jury convicted Coleman of murder, attempted murder, and child molesting. He was sentenced to death, giving him his third death sentence. He also received 2 consecutive 50-year sentences for the attempted murder and child molesting convictions. Brown was also convicted in Indiana. She too received a death sentence for the murder of Tamika Turks, making this her second death sentence. The Illinois trial represented the final legal proceeding for the murder of Vernita Wheat, the 9-year-old whose abduction marked the beginning of Coleman's crime spree. By this point, Coleman had already received 3 death sentences from 2 states and faced little chance of acquittal. He made the unusual choice to represent himself during this trial, acting as his own attorney despite the complexity of capital litigation. The prosecution presented evidence linking him to Vernita's abduction and murder. Though the physical evidence was somewhat limited, due to the 3-week decomposition period before her body was discovered. Juanita Wheat testified about how Coleman, using the alias Robert Knight, had gained her trust and convinced her to let Vernita leave with him. The trial proceeded relatively quickly, since Coleman's pattern of behavior had been established in previous convictions. The jury found him guilty of murder and aggravated kidnapping, and during the penalty phase recommended death. This gave Coleman his 4th death sentence, making him the only person in the United States at that time to hold death sentences from 3 different states. Illinois chose not to prosecute Brown separately since her Ohio and Indiana convictions were deemed sufficient. The appeals process began immediately for both defendants and would continue for nearly 18 years in Coleman's case. His attorneys challenged the death sentences on multiple constitutional grounds, arguing ineffective assistance of counsel, insufficient evidence, and procedural errors during trial. A significant legal question emerged regarding whether convictions from one state could be used as aggravating factors to support a death sentence in another state. The Illinois Supreme Court rejected this argument, reasoning that Coleman's multiple murders were relevant to his dangerousness, regardless of where they occurred. Coleman's appeals reached the U.S. Supreme Court multiple times, but the court consistently declined to intervene. Eventually, one of Coleman's Ohio death sentences for the Tony Story murder was overturned on appeal due to ineffective counsel, though the conviction itself stood. Ohio chose not to retry the penalty phase, leaving Coleman with death sentences from Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois still in effect. Brown's appeals focused primarily on her intellectual disability and her dominated relationship with Coleman. Her attorneys argued that executing someone with her level of cognitive impairment would violate constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. In 1991, Ohio Governor Richard Celeste commuted Brown's Ohio death sentence to life without parole, citing her IQ scores between 59 and 74 and her master-slave relationship with Coleman. Celeste, a death penalty opponent, commuted 8 death sentences in his final days in office, including all 4 women on Ohio's death row. However, Brown still faced the Indiana death sentence for Tamika Turks's murder. Coleman spent 18 years on death row at Mansfield Correctional Institution under high-security conditions with limited contact with other inmates or the outside world. Prison records show his family rarely visited him, with expected visits from siblings that never materialized, suggesting they had either disowned him or wanted no association with him. 3 days before his execution, Coleman was baptized, though whether this represented genuine spiritual conversion or a final attempt at sympathy remained debatable. Brown was transferred to the Ohio Reformatory for Women in Marysville after her commutation, where she served her life sentence under less restrictive conditions than death row. Her attorneys continued appealing the Indiana death sentence, arguing that the Supreme Court's 2002 ruling in Atkins v. Virginia, which prohibited executing intellectually disabled individuals, should apply retroactively to her case. By 2002, Coleman's appeals had been exhausted. The U.S. Supreme Court had declined to hear his final appeals. The Ohio Supreme Court had rejected his last-minute petitions. Governor Bob Taft had declined to grant clemency. The state of Ohio set an execution date, April 26, 2002. As the execution date approached, Coleman's attorneys made final efforts to stop it. One argument they raised was that the state's plan to allow an unusually large number of people to witness the execution via closed-circuit television would turn the execution into a spectator sport and violate Coleman's rights. Ohio typically limited the number of witnesses who could be physically present in the execution chamber, but so many victims, family members, wanted to witness Coleman's execution that the state set up a closed-circuit viewing area outside the execution building. The Ohio Supreme Court rejected this argument on April 25, 2002, just 1 day before the scheduled execution. The court found that allowing victims' families to witness the execution, even via television, did not violate Coleman's constitutional rights and served the legitimate purpose of providing closure to those affected by his crimes. Coleman was transported from death row to the death house at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville. He arrived on the afternoon of April 25th and was placed in a holding cell just steps from the execution chamber. Prison officials noted that he appeared to accept what was about to happen and was calm, though he had difficulty sleeping that night. Coleman ordered what was described as the largest final meal in Ohio prison history up to that point. He requested well-done filet mignon with mushrooms, fried chicken breasts, a salad with French dressing, sweet potato pie with whipped cream, French fries, collard greens, onion rings, cornbread, broccoli with melted cheese, biscuits and gravy, and cherry Coke. Prison officials served him this meal the evening before his execution. Coleman did not eat much the morning of his execution. He woke around 5 a.m. and ate a single piece of toast. He declined to shower or shave. He spent his final hours writing notes to family and friends, meeting with his spiritual advisors, and watching videotapes recorded by an evangelical Christian minister. Harry Walters, his two sons-in-law, and relatives of several other victims made their way to Lucasville to witness the execution. Some would be in the execution chamber itself. Others would watch via the closed-circuit television in the viewing area set up outside. On the morning of April 26, 2002, at approximately 10 a.m., Alton Coleman was led from his holding cell to the execution chamber. He walked the 13 steps between the cell and the chamber. He was strapped to a gurney. IVs were inserted into his arms. The execution team prepared the equipment that would deliver the lethal chemicals. Coleman was given an opportunity to make a final statement. He did not deliver a lengthy speech or make any dramatic proclamations. Instead, he recited Psalm 23. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." He repeated the words over and over as the process moved forward. He continued reciting the psalm, even as the chemicals began to flow into his veins. The execution protocol in Ohio at that time used a 3-drug combination. The first drug, sodium pentothal, was a sedative meant to render the inmate unconscious. The second drug, pancuronium bromide, was a paralytic that stopped breathing. The third drug, potassium chloride, stopped the heart. The process was supposed to take approximately 15 minutes from start to finish. Coleman continued reciting the psalm until the first drug took effect and he lost consciousness. The other drugs followed. His breathing stopped. His heart stopped. At 10:13 a.m., 17 years and 6 months after his arrest in Evanston, Illinois, Alton Coleman was pronounced dead. Reginald Wilkinson, director of the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction, spoke to media after the execution. He stated that Coleman had not directly expressed remorse for the killings, but that he had admitted what he's done in his own convoluted way. Coleman had written a letter before his death that included an apology for the pain he had caused, though he maintained to the end that Debra Brown, not he, had killed Marlene Walters. The witnesses who had been present, including Harry Walters and family members of other victims, left the facility. Some spoke to reporters. Harry Walters stated that seeing Coleman die had provided a sense of justice and closure after 18 years of waiting. Others simply left without comment, their expressions suggesting a mixture of relief, sadness, and exhaustion. Coleman's execution was Ohio's 4th since the state had reinstated the death penalty in 1981. He was 46 years old at the time of his death. His body was released to family members for burial, though reports indicate that few attended his funeral. At the time of Coleman's execution, Debra Brown was still alive, serving her life sentence in Ohio. She had filed motions to be allowed to visit Coleman in his final days, but those motions were denied. Coleman had not requested any contact with her. The two had not seen each other since their separate trials in the mid-1980s. After Coleman's execution, Debra Brown continued serving her Ohio life sentence while still facing an Indiana death sentence. Her attorneys appealed based on her intellectual disability, supported by consistently low IQ scores and evidence of cognitive decline. In 2018, Indiana officials withdrew the death sentence based on constitutional prohibitions against executing intellectually disabled individuals. However, they failed to notify victims' families beforehand. Laverne Turks, mother of victim Tamika, only learned about it through a phone call at Thanksgiving and expressed devastation that Brown would not face the same punishment as Coleman despite committing the same crimes. Under the agreement, Brown waived all appeals and received a 140-year sentence in addition to her life term, ensuring she will die in prison. Now in her 60s, after 40 years of incarceration at Dayton Correctional Institution, Brown has been a model inmate with no violent incidents and has reportedly expressed remorse, though families have received no direct apologies. The core question of her culpability remains unresolved. Prosecutors maintain she was a willing participant who made conscious choices to continue the violence. Defense experts argue her intellectual disability, dependent personality disorder, and complete domination by Coleman meant she lacked capacity for independent judgment. The debate reflects how different people weigh her documented cognitive impairments and lack of prior criminal history against her active participation in brutal crimes, including child murders.